make exploring the tomb an even more unsettling experience as the wraiths refuse to die properly and their screams echo endlessly. For our next legend, we're going to look at the player character. In typical Bethesda fashion, Oblivion begins with your character locked in prison. Although the game never directly explains the reason for your imprisonment, it drops some intriguing hints that suggest a darker backstory. One of the most compelling clues comes from a conversation in Skingrad with a Dunmer alchemist who reveals she fled Morrowind for unspecified reasons. During your chat with her, she asks about the fine for necrophilia in Cyrodiil, specifically mentioning repeat offenders. Without missing a beat, your character responds with at least 500 gold. This offhand remark implies a surprising familiarity with the law on necrophilia, knowledge that you likely wouldn't have unless you'd encountered the law firsthand. While this alone doesn't confirm that your character is guilty of this, it certainly raises questions. This theory deepens with the events in the Shivering Isles expansion, where the hero of Kvatch eventually becomes Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness. The transformation occurs through a process known in Elder Scrolls lore as mantling, which involves embodying a god so completely that you assume their identity and power. The climax of this transformation, called the Enantiomorph, sees you battling Jiggalag, Sheogorath's alter ego, effectively becoming Sheogorath by defeating him. As Vivek explains in Elder Scrolls lore, the Enantiomorph is a conflict between two entities so alike that they are almost indistinguishable. This battle cements your role as Sheogorath, with Jiggalag addressing you as the Mad God by the end of the conflict. Throughout the Shivering Isles storyline, Sheogorath guides you towards this transformation, nudging you to embrace his madness by appointing you as Duke or Duchess of both Mania and Dementia, thereby strengthening your influence over the Isles. Haskell, Sheogorath's loyal servant, even implies that others have attempted to take on Sheogorath's mantle before, though they failed and became mere vestiges in the realm. However, to successfully become the Daedric Prince of Madness, one must already surely possess a level of insanity well beyond the norm. Since Sheogorath doesn't actively drive you mad throughout the storyline, it's reasonable to infer that your character was already somewhat unhinged before arriving in the Shivering Isles. This brings us back to the disturbing possibility introduced in Skingrad. For someone to repeatedly engage in necrophilia despite being caught and fined implies an extreme disregard for social norms and consequences, which would imply that the player character is already completely insane. It's possible then that the hero of Kvatch's potential criminal history hints at true madness, one that makes the character an absolutely fitting candidate to mantle Sheogorath. Far from an ordinary hero, the champion of Cyrodiil may have had a much darker, more twisted past, aligning them perfectly with the madness required to become the Daedric Prince of Madness. For our next story, we're going to look at something that definitely does exist in the game, but has spawned theories and legends in its wake. The Deep Ones are mysterious subterranean beings worshipped by the inhabitants of Hakdar, an isolated town in Cyrodiil's Great Forest. Revered as deities, the Deep Ones have inspired the townsfolk to construct the Chapel of the Brethren in their honour. The residents of Hakdar, especially those most transformed by their devotion, are known as Brethren. These individuals live in the Hakdar caverns closer to their gods. At night, the townspeople descend into the caverns for gatherings where they conduct rituals dedicated to the Deep Ones, using tunnels connecting each house to the caverns. Hakdar's history with the Deep Ones began in the Third Era, when Urlav Moslin refounded the town as a mining settlement. During the excavation process, villagers stumbled upon a network of caverns beneath Hakdar where they allegedly encountered the Deep Ones. Urlav claimed to have met with the chief of the Deep Ones, who imparted his language, runes, and ancient lore to the miners. The townsfolk recorded these teachings in the Bible of the Deep Ones, a text written in Daedric runes and drawn from the obscure work Ingasta Kavata Kavakis by the slowed necromancer Ingasta. In exchange for their devotion, the Deep Ones granted wealth to the townspeople, but their blessings came at a high price. The beings demanded blood sacrifices and other dark rituals, which eventually attracted the attention of the Imperial Legion. When soldiers arrived, they destroyed much of Hackdirt, killing many and scattering the Deep Ones, who have not returned since. Despite the absence of their gods, the people of Hackdirt continued to live above and below ground, keeping the faith passed down through generations. By the year 433 of the Third Era, around 30 years after the Legion's intervention, Erlav's grandson, Vlanhondor Moslin, attempted to bring the Deep Ones back through ritual sacrifice. To this end, the townsfolk captured Dharma, an Argonian from Coral, intending to use her in their dark rituals. Their plan, however, was thwarted by the hero of Kvatch, who rescued Dharma and killed many of the Brethren in the process. Now, the only sign of the Deep One's lingering influence is a low, unsettling growl that echoes through the Hackdirt caverns. But what are the Deep Ones? Well, that's where the fans come in with speculations and theories. To start off, the quest involving the Deep Ones is believed to be inspired by The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft, where villagers worship aquatic, otherworldly creatures, also known as the Deep Ones. But the origins of the Deep Ones in Hackdirt are completely shrouded in mystery. Some fans suggest a connection to the Slode, a race of necromantic slug-like beings in the Elder Scrolls universe. Supporting this theory is the fact that Hackdirt's sacred text, the Bible of the Deep Ones, uses the Daedric runes and excerpts associated with the Slode necromancer in Gasta as mentioned earlier. The Slode, who speak in an Esperant-esque language, have a dark reputation and a mastery over necromantic and teleportation magics, making it plausible that they could be linked to the Deep Ones. There are also aesthetic similarities. Like the residents in The Shadow over Innsmouth, Hackdirt's brethren, the townsfolk closest to the Deep Ones, have large fish-like eyes, suggesting a form of transformation or hybridization. This has led some to speculate that the townsfolk might be human Slode hybrids, potentially a desperate measure by the Slode to preserve their species after they were decimated by the All Flags Navy. Alternative theories propose that the Deep Ones could be a type of Daedric entity, or perhaps even remnants of Dwemer experiments, given the mysterious and subterranean nature of Hackdirt's caverns. However, there's no solid evidence linking them to the Dwemer. Other fans find the idea that the Deep Ones could be Falmer intriguing, although geographically this is unlikely given that Hackdirt is far from typical Falmer territory. All in all, the Deep Ones remain one of Oblivion's most tantalising mysteries that continues to spark speculation and fascination among fans. Next, we're going to look at a bit of an oddity in the White Gold Tower basement. Players have to enter this basement during a Thieves Guild quest to steal an Elder Scroll. This peculiar area contains oversized items, including a massive hourglass dubbed the Sands of Time, along with giant furniture and other strange clutter. This basement has led fans to speculate about its origin and purpose, as the furniture, although in an Imperial style, appears far too large for typical use. Some fans initially assumed that the oversized items might have been remnants of Iliad culture given the tower's Iliad origins. However, the Imperial design of the furniture doesn't align with Iliad aesthetics, and it seems unlikely that the Imperials would keep ancient relics of that scale hidden away in a basement. One theory suggests these items could be tied to a visit from a giant or an embassy of giants, possibly from Atmora. This idea is bolstered by references in the Elder Scrolls lore, such as a depiction of Tiber Septim or Talos meeting with the King of Atmora, who appears significantly larger than the typical human, resembling a giant. Others speculate that these items might belong to Sanguin, the Daedric Prince of Revelry, who supposedly spent time in the Imperial Palace with Riemann Cyrodiil. Given Sanguin's chaotic nature, it's conceivable that he might have left behind some trophies or oversized relics from his exploits. Additionally, comparisons have been drawn between the oversized objects in the basement and the similarly surreal furniture found in Arkved's tower during Vermina's Daedric quest, which could indicate Daedric influence or enchantments that warp the perception of time and space. A few fans have posited that the basement might simply be a storage area for relics too dangerous or mysterious to be displayed publicly, such as enchanted items that destabilize time and space. Some even suggest that these oversized items may appear and disappear in the basement due to the unique magical nature of the White Gold Tower, which is thought to be a powerful artifact in itself with influence over the fabric of reality. Another intriguing theory links the items to Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric prince who attempted to conquer Tamriel during the Oblivion Crisis. Some fans interpret the presence of giant furnishings as symbols of Dagon's former influence, or even as artifacts from a time when Tamriel might have been part of his realm, as Mankar Cameron claims in his speeches. According to Cameron's view, Dagon sees Tamriel as his birthright and refers to the land as occupied lands that he intends to reclaim. This theory aligns with the notion that these oversized relics could serve as reminders of this forgotten era when Dagon or other powerful entities held sway over Mundus. In the end, though, the oversized items in the White Gold Tower basement remain an enigmatic part of Oblivion's lore. Their purpose is left ambiguous, which keeps everyone, as ever, guessing as to the true story behind them. The next story is very cool, starting with speculations and then growing from there, but I won't spoil it all right away. Let's get into it. The Unmarked Cave in Oblivion holds a certain allure for completionists, but exploring all its nooks and crannies isn't straightforward. This cave contains inaccessible sections, traps, and mysteries that hinted at an abandoned questline. One player, eager to tick every location off their list, recalled venturing through the cave with high acrobatics skills to jump up the holes in the cave's first section. But after reaching a dead end with a locked door, they were stumped by an immovable rock blocking the way back out. A forum user helpfully pulled information from the game's wiki at the time, shedding light on the mysterious design of Unmarked Cave. Apparently, it seemed this cave was likely intended for a quest that didn't make it into the final game. There's that inaccessible door that requires a unique key, one that simply doesn't exist, not even in the game's construction set. This locked door leads to the cave's deeper section, intriguingly named Unmarked Cave Mazeway. In another area, the Black Queen's Hall within the cave contains a chest marked Chest MS-25 Dungeon Mythic Enemy Rare 01 in the game's files, further evidence that it was meant for a quest that was ultimately cut. The chest itself, empty. The game also offers one rumour dialogue in Shadenhall. A character mentions the Red Queen drinks there. It was unclear at the time who the Red Queen was or if she connected to the Black Queen in Unmarked Cave, but this added to player speculation that these names could tie into an unfinished quest. For those at the time who were determined to explore the whole cave, a workaround was found. Players could start at the cave's exit using an acrobatics exploit to jump up the hole in the ceiling and work backwards, but even then, the locked door remained stubbornly sealed from both sides. Other players on the forum shared their struggles with the cave's rock wall, which sometimes blocked the way unpredictably. One player who didn't know about the exploit ended up stuck inside, having saved their game and thus losing a favourite character to the cave's unyielding design. Others reported that the rock wall's behaviour seemed to vary between attempts. Sometimes it moved, other times it was immovable, prompting players to re-enter and reload multiple times. But even after all that trouble, there was little to reward the effort beyond the satisfaction of having fully explored the cave. Anything there was simply a tease of what seemed to be a lost quest. But this wasn't enough for the Oblivion community, who, as ever, dove headfirst into the mystery and not only came back with details but something even cooler than that. According to files discovered in the game, there was a planned quest titled Broken Promises. This quest could be initiated by speaking to an NPC named Strantis in Coral. He would ask the player to retrieve an heirloom from Holgerda. This request, however, would turn out to be a trap. When the player arrived at Broken Promises cave, Strantis would reveal his true intentions. He had tricked the player into the cave to kill them and take their belongings. After dealing with Strantis, the player would return to the Newlands Lodge to find Holgerda missing, leaving only a note. This note would direct the player to Unmarked Cave, where they would discover that Holgerda had been forced to work under the influence of another character known as the Black Queen, a necromancer and rival who had kidnapped Holgerda's family to coerce her cooperation. To free Holgerda and her family, the player would have to confront and defeat the Black Queen, along with her monstrous pet, a giant black Durzorg, a creature similar to a Daedroth but larger and more dangerous. Though this quest was never completed for the final release, dedicated modders resurrected it via mods like Oblivion Uncut, allowing players to experience it in full. This whole story is exactly why I love these games and the community around them. It's a full circle story from rumours to investigations to literally resurrecting cut content for everyone to enjoy. Absolutely fantastic stuff. A smaller story that's quite amusing and sparked speculation is next on our list. A player explained online that back in 2006, GameStop listed an expansion pack titled Knights of the White Stallion. This of course led to speculation, but it turned out to be an error or mistranslation, likely referencing the Knights of the Nine expansion. However, a few fans expressed disappointment as they thought it would have been interesting if Oblivion had more quests with the Knights of the White Stallion and Leowyn. I think it would have been cool as well, just goes to show how anything can stir up the imagination. This next story was more likely caused by a mod, however, it may have thrown up something that did exist or could have potentially existed in the base game. In a Reddit thread, a user shared their experience with some mysterious encounters. They described coming across a unique goblin assassin during a quest where they defended a farm from a goblin raid. This goblin assassin seemed to be a rare unrecorded enemy as the player could not replicate the encounter in later playthroughs. Another player suggested using the Oblivion construction set to search for the goblin assassin in the game's files, but the OP replied that they had already tried without success. So, is there a mysterious goblin assassin completely buried somewhere in Oblivion beyond the reach of data miners? It's almost certainly impossible, but it's still fun to consider. This next story, full disclosure, was caused by a mod, but I absolutely love the tale, so I wanted to share it with you as it fits into the campfire stories genre and was certainly discussed online amongst fans. A player recounted an unsettling experience while on a quest to gather evidence against Shadenhall's guard commander. Surprisingly, the quest indicator directed them to the abandoned house instead of Shadenhall Castle, specifically to the basement where the Dark Brotherhood Sanctuary is located. However, upon arrival, a new and unlisted location, the old recruitment tunnels, appeared on the map. With what they described as mounting dread, the player ventured inside. The tunnel started as a typical dimly lit corridor, but soon descended into total darkness, forcing the player to light a torch. The torch revealed a stationary skeleton just a few steps away, facing away from the player. With high-level stats, the player expected to defeat it easily, but the skeleton took no damage. Terrified, the player turned to leave, only to find the exit vanished. The skeleton attacked and killed the player in a single strike. Days later, the player installed a zombie apocalypse mod that allowed hordes of undead to infest Cyrodiil, starting with Shadenhall. Determined to verify the old recruitment tunnel's existence, the player returned to the now zombie-overrun Shadenhall, barricaded themselves inside the abandoned house, and re-entered the basement. Turning around, they were horrified to see dozens of zombies crammed into the small basement space ready to attack. The overwhelming mass of NPCs crashed the game, leaving the player with lingering questions. What were these mysterious tunnels? Who were they recruiting? And how did the zombies break through the barricades? The player concluded that the tunnels were likely part of an undocumented mod, though they never planned to enter the tunnels or revisit the abandoned house again. Now, there's elements here of the good old creepypasta genre that was all the rage back in the day, but I'm interested to know if anyone else ever encountered the old recruitment tunnels, and if so, what mod it came from. Moving back to player character speculations. In fan theory discussions, one user speculated that the player character might not actually exist prior to the start of the game. This theory suggests that your character, the prisoner, isn't simply a random inmate, but someone with a far more mysterious and divine origin. The theory posits that your character wasn't just imprisoned, but was created by the gods at the exact moment before Emperor Uriel Septim and his blades enter the cell. Essentially, your character only starts existing in that cell, meant as a signal to the Emperor of his approaching doom. There's some intriguing evidence that could back up this idea. For one, the blades are confused. To find your character, they are stating, "What's this prisoner doing here? The cell is supposed to be off limits." An odd reaction if you'd been a long-term resident. Additionally, in conversation, your character has the option to ask, "Why am I in jail?" A pretty odd question if you already know why you were imprisoned. The Emperor's answer, "Perhaps the gods have placed you here so that we may meet," only adds to the theory that your character's existence may be more divine intervention than personal history. Then there's the fact that your character can ask the Emperor, "Who are you?" which wouldn't make sense if they had prior knowledge of the world. Could this truly mean that your character is a sort of blank slate, an entity created solely to fulfill a role in Cyrodiil's turbulent fate? The original poster of the theory suggested that the character could be a Chezarine, an avatar of the Adric god Shor, also known as Lorcan. This theory would explain why no one seems to recognise the character. There's no record of their past, and they lack any memory of who they are or how they ended up in their current predicament. Another user took this idea a step further by pointing out that the champion of Cyrodiil is sometimes seen as an aspect of Sheol-Gorath, and that perhaps at the start of the game your character could be a fragment of Sheol-Gorath, split out of time and sent as a mortal to preserve the balance of power among the Daedra and thwart Mehrunes Dagon's invasion. This interpretation would mean that your entire journey in Oblivion and then later in Shivering Isles is actually a god's hidden plan to restore order. This discussion led to a more detailed exploration of Chim, C-H-I-M, one of the most mind-bending concepts in Elder Scrolls. A user described Chim as a realization that a character in Mundus, the world within the games, is actually fictional. In this moment, they understand that they don't truly exist as an independent entity. Many who reach this awareness simply cease to exist, their identity zero-summing and vanishing entirely. However, if they manage to acknowledge this and still retain their individuality, they achieve Chim, a state that grants godlike powers. Only two known figures, Vivek and Tiber Septim, are said to have achieved this state. So, what do you think after hearing this mind-bending speculation? Is the prisoner an empty vessel that only started existing when you booted up the game? Or perhaps even a piece of Sheol-Gorath himself before you even get to the Shivering Isles? Moving on to other speculations and weirdness, on a forum thread, players shared spooky encounters and unexplained glitches that left them unsettled. The original poster described an unsettling moment near Fort Rails. While exploring, they heard battle music suddenly start, and their sneak indicator turned yellow. Suddenly, a goblin materialised in front of them, only to vanish just as quickly. The player nervously wondered if they'd have to face more of these teleporting enemies. Another player recounted their own spooky experience with a Minotaur lord who teleported behind them unexpectedly near the Bloodworks. Attempting to improve their archery skills in a small corner, they were caught off guard as the beast seemingly appeared from nowhere and attacked, leaving them with no escape route. Enemies are scary enough without the power to teleport at will. Is this something that's ever happened to you in the game? Our next story takes us to Skingrad and involves an infamous NPC, Glarthir. So what's the speculation? Well, some players don't think he's as delusional as it might at first seem. The story begins simply enough. Upon arriving in Skingrad, players are approached by Glarthir, who furtively asks them to meet him behind the chapel at midnight, far from prying eyes. He believes he's being watched and insists there's a conspiracy against him. When players ask around, townsfolk are quick to dismiss his concerns, describing Glarthir as harmlessly mad. Captain Dion, a no-nonsense man, even steps in to warn players to avoid Glarthir. Yet, the more one digs into the story, the harder it becomes to dismiss Glarthir's paranoia entirely. Glarthir's list of suspects is odd, yet oddly believable in the context of Skingrad's secretive nature. First, there's Bernadette, a quiet local who spends hours each day in the chapel of Julianos. Her behaviour seems routine, but Glarthir is certain she's watching him. In his notes, he mentions finding patches of disturbed earth around the vineyard, suspecting David another supposed conspirator of burying messages. Though the vineyard seems innocuous by day, the dirt mounds do add a strange note, suggesting hidden meetings or secret communiques, details the mythic Dawn might use in their plotting. Then there's the enigmatic Valandris, a Julianos priest who some suspect may not be what he seems. One player recalls how Valandris, in an offhand remark, refers to himself as a primate, a title that they think feels a bit out of place in Cyrodiil. The players in the thread debate whether this could imply a link to the Marikati Selective, a fanatical sect known for their complex views on divinity and Aedra. For some players who speculated online, however, the most unsettling part of the quest is not Glarthir's paranoia, but the strange behaviour that seems to emerge around him. Some players recount that when they followed David or Bernadette, town guards or other NPCs would tail them, or in some cases frame them for minor crimes like theft. Subtle hints perhaps that there's more to Glarthir's story. Captain Dion himself seems implicated, often appearing conveniently to monitor players' actions or even, in some theories, serve as a direct enforcer of the Count's covert directives. Years after the game's release, players in online forums still pore over each detail, scouring the quest for overlooked clues, debating the motivations of Skingrad's townsfolk. Some now regard Glarthir's paranoia as perhaps more rational than they first thought, his suspicions fed by the guarded behaviour and cryptid responses of the townsfolk. In amongst this long-running debate about whether Glarthir was actually onto something or if he was just outright paranoid, some potential evidence was mentioned. While most players initially assume he's just a bit mad, after all he's creeping around corners convinced the whole town is out to get him, one player claimed they stumbled upon something that might validate his suspicions, a mysterious letter, some kind of proof hidden in one of the NPC's homes confirming that yes, people were keeping tabs on Glarthir. But there's a problem. Despite countless players retracing their steps across multiple playthroughs, this supposed letter remains elusive. The players swore up and down that they remember finding it years ago, buried in the Surly brothers' home or somewhere else in Skingrad, only for it to vanish on later runs. This has led to all sorts of theories, from it being an Easter egg exclusive to the original Xbox version to it being a kind of Mandela effect where people collectively remember something that never actually existed. Even years after the game's release, some players are still meticulously scouring Glarthir's suspects and scrutinising his rambling notes, hoping to find the one shred of evidence that he wasn't just another crazed NPC. So, was Glarthir right? Or is this just a fan-fueled wild goose chase? The ambiguity has become part of the legend. Maybe we'll never know, but the mystery itself is enough to keep some players coming back. And on a completely different note, did you know that there's a beef conspiracy that has sparked a surprising amount of conversation among fans who are just starting to wonder, where exactly does Cyrodiil's beef come from? In the game, you'll run into all kinds of animals that logically source the meats on sale: sheep for mutton, deer for venison, boars for boar meat, and so on. But cows? There aren't any cows wandering around Cyrodiil, and yet beef somehow makes its way to the markets. Some fans have floated the idea that beef might actually be horse meat. After all, orcs get teased in the game for eating horses, so maybe they've found a way to pass it off as beef to the unsuspecting public. Then there's an even wilder theory. What if the beef is actually minotaur meat? Minotaurs are half-bull creatures you can encounter in the wilds, and one player pointed out that while players can only harvest minotaur horns, maybe NPCs are getting their hands on the rest. Sure, that all sounds a bit dramatic, but the mystery is oddly compelling. We're so used to seeing beef as a staple food source that the lack of cows in Cyrodiil really stands out once you notice it. So maybe it's nothing, but for anyone who's ever found a suspicious bit of beef on sale, it's fun to imagine that the people of Cyrodiil might be eating something a little unexpected. So there you have it, folks, another bunch of the weird, wonderful and wacky to set off your imagination. If you've got stories to share, share them below, and of course thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
What's up guys, it's Big Willie, and I just spent the last few days data mining all of Schedule 1's code. I ended up finding a bunch of exploits along the way that I legitimately haven't heard anyone talk about before, so I needed to make sure I shared them with you all. Like being able to double your money every single week, or getting 3,000 XP in one day without selling any drugs. What are the actual odds for the casino? And maybe, just maybe, I found some secret things Tyler has been working on that aren't even on the roadmap. You're going to want to stick around until the end for this one because there are some things I found that I don't think anybody else knows about. Now let's get into it. A wise man once said, buy gold and sit on it. That is the key to success. Except, not like this. Did you know that one of the best investments you can do in the mid to late game is buying gold with your surplus money? Well, I sure as hell didn't. I thought it was literally just a decoration. Until I stumbled upon the code that determines how much money the pawn shop offers you for a product. Now, originally I thought he offered a random amount every day, but it turns out it's actually pre-calculated. Without getting too far into the weeds, basically what the code does is take the first letter of the item you're selling plus the current day of the week and adds it to a graph between 44 and 180% of the actual value. This means that each item's first letter in the current day correlates to how much money you'll get offered by the pawn shop. So if you try to sell a gold bar at the pawn shop, depending on the day, you'll get either 4,500 or 18,000. And since gold is one of the most expensive non-product items in the game, this makes it super easy to stock up on it and sell it when the timing is right. And what time is best, you ask? Thursday. Thursday is the best time to sell the gold that you stocked up on during the week. So what I do is every single day, once my businesses have finished laundering my money, I immediately run to Herbert's shop and I buy all the gold bars I can. I do this every day until Thursday, and then I dump it like it's the stock market during COVID. I end up making around $500,000 every single week just doing this. Now keep in mind, this does get paid out in cash, so you can't just go spend it at a store. But here's the beautiful thing about it. You can just launder that very cash you just got and redo the entire process each and every week. Just keep enough cash in your bank to keep your operations flowing. With this method, you are quite literally making passive income with compounding interest. It's like Wall Street, except we're making the drugs instead of taking them. Now this one is actually the reason why I started data mining this game in the first place. You see, I kept getting my counteroffers rejected and I couldn't figure out why. But after doing some digging, I finally figured out how it actually works. Every customer has a certain enjoyment of different products in the game. For example, Genghis hates ice, but he loves that Colombian snow. And Jesse is a massive tweaker, but isn't a big fan of the ganja. And if a customer really enjoys your product, you can offer a ridiculous amount of money, and they're very likely to accept.
Tell them to bring me my money.
However, if they do not like the product you have for sale, you can actually counteroffer them a different product that they enjoy more in order to still get a lot of money out of them. You can go to the website schedule1wiki.org, and under the Customers tab, you can see every single customer's preferred product and their budget. It's a super useful resource that I use all the time, and I'll leave a link to it down in the description below. Schedule 1 is discriminating against certain NPCs. Well, not really, but some NPCs do have a shorter cooldown for when they're able to buy drugs again, and it's entirely based on their name. Yeah, for some reason the cooldown period is based on their name's first letter, which means that NPCs whose names start with F, P, and Z will have a way shorter period before they can buy again compared to other names. Shout out my boy Peterfile. I swear he is the most consistent customer I got. Now this one is probably the most useful tip out of all of these. I managed to find a way to get 3,000 XP in a single day. When I was scouring the code, I stumbled upon the add XP function, and so I decided to take a look at what possible sources there are for getting XP. Now, you all probably know that you get 20 XP for each sale you do, and 10 XP if a dealer does it instead. But did you know that you can get XP from escaping the cops? It turns out that when escaping from the cops while in Wanted Dead or Alive, it gives you 60 XP. Now, you shouldn't try this in real life, but I found out that aiming a gun at a police officer will immediately escalate your current crime level to Wanted Dead or Alive. And each time you escape the cops, you'll get 60 XP for it. Which means that if you trap the police officers at the police station with a Viper, run out and wave a gun in their face, and then hide for 30 seconds, you'll get 60 XP. And if you do this for the entire day, you end up with 3,000 XP, which is literally more experience than you would get selling drugs. This is easily the best way to level up in the mid to late game. And while you wait for the wanted level to clear, maybe you should go hit the casino down the street because, contrary to real life, gambling is actually extremely profitable in Schedule 1. The slot machine is an absolute money printer. And no, I'm not sponsored by Stake.com. The reason the slots are so profitable is because the odds are unweighted. This means that you have a completely neutral 1 in 6 chance to get any symbol. You're just as likely to get a lemon as you are the 7. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the math and probability calculations, so you're just going to have to trust me here, but the slots have an EV of 135%. And for those of you who aren't fucking nerds, this means that if you put in $1,000, you are expected to make $1,350 on average. It's a slot machine with no house edge whatsoever. But if card games are more your style, I also learned something new about blackjack and Ride the Bus. The entire time you're playing these games, the game is running through an imaginary deck of cards in the background and keeping track of which cards have been played. As someone who works in technology, Tyler did not have to do this. It would have been 10 times easier not to track the discarded cards and just randomly generate the next one, and I bet no one would have ever noticed. But he really went out of his way to add that extra polish. You can really tell how much he seriously cares about this game, and it gives me a lot of hope for the future. And honestly, the fact that the card games are fair surprised me a lot, because I cannot count the amount of times that I've been playing blackjack and the dealer magically happens to draw the exact card they need to win. I was like, this shit has got to be rigged, right? But in reality, it's a skill issue, and I'm just garbage. It's not rigged at all.
Skill issue.
As I was data mining this game, I also found multiple unfinished features that I'm guessing Tyler is going to add in the future, or maybe he just decided to discontinue them. But I figured you all would want to know about these. The game has code for a utilities app which shows the water and power usage of your properties. It also has unused fields for dumpster counts and emptying costs, which would mean that every time you or your employees run the tap water, it would cost you 10 cents per liter, and the price per kilowatt is set at 25 cents. Also, there's a model for a small power tower that you'd hook up to your machines. These power towers are a bit special because they would be constructible outside of the property instead of inside. So maybe you were supposed to hook it up to the utility poles first and then to your equipment? I honestly don't know. I haven't seen anybody else even mention this before. I was also able to find an alternative dealer management screen that seemingly has controls for rest, contracts, assigned vehicles, and products. This could have been an old alternative version of what we have now, but all code referencing this menu has been cut, so I think it's just an old version, but it's still really interesting to see how dealers were supposed to have cars they could sell out of.
I'm in my mum's car. Broom, broom.
In the code, there is a model for a character titled Loan Shark. He wears jeans and a flannel t-shirt, and he drives around in a shitbox with bullet holes. I think maybe this is a mechanic coming out regarding your suppliers. Maybe they put out a hit on you if you don't ever pay them back. You know our girl Miss Shirley Watts does not play around. But it could be something else entirely. So bear with me and put on your tinfoil hats for a minute here. Do you remember the two shady people Uncle Nelson sends you to meet in the prologue? Well, they kind of look like the Loan Shark model in the code. Sure, their shitbox doesn't have bullet holes, but one of them is wearing the flannel from the model underneath his vest. And if you look carefully, hidden in the trees right next to the barn, there are 2 dirt piles. In the game's code, these dirt piles are named Loan Shark graves. Coincidence? I think not. I'm starting to think they're the ones that tipped off the feds, and old Uncle Nelson had some shooters take care of them. And I figured I would throw in some more random facts I found that weren't really interesting enough to warrant their own section. The slot machine has a check for if the game is running from the Unity editor, which means that if you can somehow trick the game into thinking it's running from inside the editor, you can get jackpots on every single spin. You can actually force all dead drops to go to just one box, since the game rules out dead drop boxes that have any items in them. If you put an item in all of the boxes except for one, they should only go to that last empty box. And the game has a is white function, which checks if the sum of your skin color's RGB is larger than 1.5. And that's all the secret stuff I was able to find, but if y'all are curious about anything else, leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to investigate it. This video took around 50 hours to make. Between all of the editing and the massive amount of research I had to do, it was definitely a task. But I feel like it was worth it. So if you'd like to see more content like this, go ahead and click that subscribe button. It genuinely helps a lot more than you realize. Peace.
Over the last year, I've talked a lot about how Frieren has a remarkable way of both embracing and subverting tropes. And in thinking about that recently, I noticed just how engaging a good surprise can be. I also came to the conclusion that there's an important distinction between surprise and shock. I think when a story has twists, it showcases this. People can often immediately name examples of media, directors, and stories that are defined by their twists, shocking the audience with a sudden realization that recontextualizes a lot of what's been going on. But sometimes surprises are subtle. They don't hit you over the head with a big, grand realization. Because while twists are easy to see and define, I think surprises are just as important and a lot harder to recognize. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're exploring how a show can be so surprising, but rarely shocking. This entire video feels like it's focusing on something that's really hard to define, so the argument is absolutely semantic. I'm using words like shock and surprise to mean different things when it's just as reasonable to interpret them as interchangeable. But this distinction is important for today's video, because when I'm differentiating between the two, I'm placing shock as a subcategory of surprise. Like, not all fruit are apples, but all apples are fruit. But the question still lies in why I think this distinction is so important. Twists, or shocking turns of event in stories, feel drastically different than the thing I'm trying to highlight. But they're built off of the same foundation, engaging the audience through unexpected writing decisions. So to understand this better, let's start by looking at the audience as a collective. Obviously, anyone that's reading a book or watching a show is having an individual relationship with it. But creators often lump all those people into a larger collective, an individual thing. It's really hard for me to see the statistic of how many people watch my videos each month and think of them as individuals. I can't conceptualize it. It's too many people with too many varying perspectives. So instead, I look at general trends. What is the reception across hundreds of thousands of people? This is where tropes come into play. A narrative device used across multiple stories that audiences start to recognize as recurring. The interesting thing about tropes is ultimately I think they're determined by the viewer and what media they've consumed in the past. But creators have to work off of a more broad landscape. What tropes have been overused? What will people recognize? And how can a writer use that to their advantage? Some probably immediately come to mind when it comes to storytelling, but YouTube videos offer a really obvious example. YouTube is full of many different tropes. Have you noticed that thing I do where I say, my name is Pei, and today we're talking about blah blah blah, that I put at the front of every one of my videos? I do that for very specific reasons. I don't really put my face in many videos, and the subject is always a different anime people already care about, so there's not really much for people to attach onto when it comes to my channel as a brand. I add that little producer tag so when people stumble across my videos 3-4 times, they start to realize, oh, I keep coming back to this one guy's arguments. If you look at a lot of successful video essayists, they tend to include some sort of intro, a tag that makes their content more recognizable for recurring viewers.
Hi, my name is Tony, and this is Every Frame of Painting.
Now, a more common trope that all of you will recognize is all the different strategies people have used for engagement. They're often referred to as calls to action, asking people to subscribe, like, or comment. There have been whole metas to it, where people adopt different strategies that become widely popular. For example, pointing towards what percentage of viewers are subscribed to a channel that are consuming the content. As far as I know, that was popularized by the Minecraft YouTuber Dream, and then everyone started to adopt it. I tend to lean towards less calls to action, but I do it too. And the reason so many people do it is because most of the time it works. There's huge statistical differences between an effective call to action and a video without one, but they also wear out quick. As soon as a call to action becomes a cliche, suddenly it'll hurt more than it helps, disrupting the flow of a video and inclining people to do the opposite of what a creator's asking. So the way it tends to work is a creator comes up with an effective strategy, other people start to emulate it, it is over-adopted, oversaturated, and then eventually becomes a cliche. This is also true of other forms of media, like storytelling. There's kind of an inherent paradox to telling stories because there are so many norms, structures, and tropes that are used regularly. But that has to be balanced with not being too predictable. If stories are too predictable, it often gets in the way of engagement and immersion. Emotional beats will fall flat. But if you break away too much from standard storytelling structure, it actually alienates audiences. It's harder to follow what's going on. Audiences at large have been trained to have expectations about the general flow of a story, and stories that are too non-conforming generally won't do well on a wide scale. It's a weird and really interesting part of storytelling, because stories are often influenced by the environment they're released into, like this weird meta fourth wall thing. Now, sometimes good writers will factor in that context, using tropes to subvert the audience's expectations, because something I've noticed in all of my favorite pieces of media lately is that they consistently surprise me, finding new, interesting, fresh ways to explore an already comfortable structure. Frieren on paper is an incredibly cut and dry fantasy story, and I really don't like that style of world building. I kind of have an inherent bias against it. And part of what I think makes Frieren so special is the way they use those tropes to make the entire story more interesting. Frieren in its origin was initially created to be a gag comedy. I think this is a big reason as to why trope is such a major component of the story. In my brain, that idea feels reminiscent of things like Konosuba or One Punch Man, satire utilizing tropes for the sake of comedy. Now, I still think Frieren is a very funny show, but I also think it uses tropes in a way that feel emotionally significant too. I think this is a major component of why the story is so consistently surprising. There's a self-awareness that it uses time and time again, leading to decisions that consistently catch me off guard. I think the more you analyze media and look closely, the more predictable it starts to become. Kind of like being able to predict a rhyme at the end of a verse in a song you've never listened to before because of context clues. And I've noticed recently that I really value stories that consistently surprise me. And this is where the difference between surprise and shock really comes in. Take for example a theoretical horror movie where a character's walking down a dark hall. You can know that something shocking is going to happen, a jump scare or a reveal, and not be surprised at all. Another good example is how M. Night Shyamalan has kind of written himself into a corner. Every movie he makes, there's an expectation that there'll be a twist at the end. When you know a twist is coming, you're less surprised by it, which undermines its effectiveness. Being shocked and surprised are not the same thing. They can overlap, but they don't have to. My favorite stories recently are ones that consistently surprise me. There's this fiction series I've been reading lately called Dungeon Crawler Carl that I think is outstanding. It really engages in this in a way that feels very reminiscent of what I love about Frieren. It's such a powerful tool, and it doesn't have to be big or grandiose. These decisions don't have to come as shocks, and I almost think they're more sustainably used when they don't. So when in Frieren do I think that this is used most effectively? Let's take a look. Here's a quick spoiler warning for anyone that needs it for Season 1 of Frieren Beyond Journey's End. The first example that comes to mind is Zine as a character. There's this classic structure that we've seen time and time again, especially in shonen, where a party slowly adopts new members. Having a character fit in neatly with an ensemble that the audience loves is very difficult, and it's especially impressive when they shift an already interesting dynamic to make it even better. I really believe Zine is an outstanding character, and for me, everything in my gut indicated that he'd stay with the party after his introduction. In Frieren's original party, there was a warrior, mage, priest, and hero. So when Zine was introduced, he filled the obvious missing role in having a priest. It also created this possibility where Frieren could step into that role as a hero. I don't know, that's interesting. The whole story is built around running parallels between the old party and new one. It's a brave decision to let go of a character that was working so well. It surprised me, but it felt beautifully in line with both the character and themes of the story. It was a decision I never expected, but also wouldn't change in retrospect. Another surprise comes in the way Frieren navigates Fern and Stark's budding romance. Romances often take a lot of space in a story, but with rare exception, Fern and Stark's developing relationship falls to the background. Even when they're given big moments, more often than not, it's multifaceted, serving some purposes outside of just their dynamic. There's generally an expectation that if romance is going to be introduced between important characters, it's something that's going to be delved into. And in the future, it probably will continue to develop, but they're taking their time in a way that really works. It's not at all how I'd expect a slice of life or fantasy adventure to treat romance. To me, it feels kind of singular. I can't think of another story that does a budding relationship in the same way. In the exact opposite direction of love and romance, or maybe full circle, is the action in Frieren. Especially in the first half of the season, this show occasionally dips into extreme action for just a brief moment. Anime, especially old shonens, have a tendency to really draw out conflict. It's so common for fights to span many episodes, but some of the best fight sequences in Frieren are so brief. Another surprise comes in rewatching Frieren and realizing some of my favorite little stories are only half of an episode. I've made whole videos praising Frieren's ability to tell entire stories in only a couple minutes, and when I finally got used to that, they changed it up, creating a mage exam, taking a leap of faith to tell the story in a different way, and it ended up being so crucial, developing some of my favorite characters in the first season. Denkian had so much more substance and significance than I originally expected. All of these little surprises I probably could make an entire video about if I haven't already, and kind of the point of this video is I wouldn't really classify any of these as shocking. They're not twists, they're just unexpected directions that hold up under scrutiny. They don't undermine any of the setup, they don't act in opposition to what I would expect from the character, and they're still super satisfying, almost more so. I think this is an exceptionally difficult thing to do in storytelling. Recently I've been working on my own writing, and seeing this is almost discouraging because no matter what I do, I'm kinda gonna be bad. Analyzing media and creating it require different skill sets that do inform one another but aren't one-to-one. So as I'm analyzing stories that I think are really well written, I'm noticing just how engaging they are, and I'm admiring how difficult it is to do that as effectively as they have. It's very hard to do this. To me, it's a sign of expertise or coincidence. When a story does it time and time again, it seems like chance isn't a major component at play. That's why I find this entire concept of surprising without being shocking so interesting. Because as easy as it is to get caught up analyzing any piece of media, sometimes they come along and are just engaging.
Hey, how's it going guys? It's Nate here, and welcome to another Skyrim investigative video. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know one of the concepts I'm most obsessed with in the Elder Scrolls' lore is the mystery concerning the Eye of Magnus, and exactly what the object's purpose and backstory are. In case you're unfamiliar, shortly after the player has become a student at the College of Winterhold, you'll be invited on a field trip to explore the ruins of the oldest known Nord settlement in all of Skyrim. Possibly the oldest human settlement in Tamriel, period. While here, one thing leads to another, and your class accidentally finds their way into a secret, previously undiscovered chamber, where this big blue sphere can be found floating on a stage of sorts. Obviously very intrigued to discover something like this in mankind's most ancient city, professors at the college quickly launch an investigation and conclude that the orb is channeling unfathomable amounts of magical power. They nickname it the Eye of Magnus, after the ancient god of magic, and decide to take possession of it for further research. The remainder of this guild's storyline is all about trying to figure out what this Eye of Magnus really is, and later on, stopping a rogue Thalmor agent from using it to conquer the world or something. Eventually, a mysterious group of teleporters calling themselves the Sigic Order just takes the eye away from the college outright, citing your irresponsibility, and that's how their entire questline ends. Notably though, despite all of our work, we're never told what the heck the Eye actually is, nor what its origins are and why it was being held in mankind's first settlement on the continent. So, in today's video, it's those questions we're going to set out to answer. We're going to run through everything we know about the object's history, and then go through a couple very interesting connections it seems to have with other games in the Elder Scrolls franchise. Connections I don't think anyone else has made, and there's a particular set of revelations I think you'll love. In the end, while we may not 100% settle everything, we're gonna come pretty close. And I think you'll be happy with where we leave. Anyway, without any further ado, let's do further. Now, I've already provided a relatively general overview of the Eye in the College of Winterhold storyline, and we'll hop back to that in a bit. But first, let me explain the history of the location we find it in, and why that makes the orb such a tremendous deal. You see, it's located deep within Sarthal, perhaps the first Nord colony in all of Skyrim, and definitely the first one we know of. Nords, of course, are not natives to Tamriel, despite what Ulfric might claim. Their homeland, where their race really emerged, is the continent of Atmora, a landmass across the northern Sea of Ghosts that's never been mapped. While it was once habitable, since the First Era, it's evidently gotten so cold, no life is able to survive there. Sometime thousands of years ago, in the Merethic Era, the Nords began sailing down and establishing small settlements in modern-day Skyrim. As mentioned, the first of these was where we find the Eye, Sarthal, which would become the largest and most prosperous city of them all. As this migration was underway, though, Skyrim was already being lived in by a different race of people, the Snow Elves, or Falmer, who had their own cities, society, and government. Initially, relations between these two colliding peoples were shockingly good. The elves were seemingly cool with Nords moving in, which was very nice of them, given how this stuff usually works out on Earth. And before long, trade was running abundant. But then, something must have changed. This is where our history gets a little fuzzy. Some books claim the Snow Elves started to grow resentful of their new human neighbors. Others argue there was no breakdown of relations at all. But nonetheless, what we do know is that one night, a Snow Elven army creeped up on the city of Sarthal and launched an all-out attack. The Nord defenders were totally unprepared, and allegedly, almost every single one of the city's inhabitants was put to the sword. This night would come to be known as the Night of Tears. Again, accounts differ. Some authors argue the Elven attack was an obvious result of jealousy and fear of the humans, who were growing too strong, but then some books allege their motives were more mysterious and complicated than that. The Imperial Report on Sarthal, which was written by an Imperial researcher thousands of years after these events happened, points out that there's really no evidence of deteriorating relations or jealousy between either society. And the writer notes that the way the elves attacked Sarthal was weird, saying, quote, "After reviewing the evidence, my inclination is to suggest that not only did the elves know the apparent layout of the city, but that their assault was based on a specific directive, and perhaps a singular goal." End quote. Another book on the matter, conveniently called Night of Tears, is even more damning. It contains the following paragraph. Quote, "The Nords found something when they built their city, buried deep in the ground. They attempted to keep it buried, but the elves learned of it and coveted it for themselves. Thus, they assaulted Sarthal. Their goal not to drive the Nords out, but to secure this power for themselves." End quote. I wonder what this object could have been. Now, of course, the Falmer attack on the city would ultimately backfire horrendously, as the town's leader, a Nord named Ysgramor, and a few of his sons did manage to escape. In fact, they were among the only survivors. How lucky. Together, they sailed back to Atmora, where they told tales of the horrific slaughter, and quickly formed an army of the most powerful warriors they could find. With this army, Ysgramor and his boys then came back to Skyrim, and boy did they open up a can of whoop-ass on the elves. Not only was every Falmer army quickly defeated, but then the Nords started burning all of their cities, destroying all of their temples, and hunting down every single elf they could get their hands on. Men, women, children, elder, all of them would pay. Oh, that got kinda dark. Well, in a few short years, thus, Ysgramor had effectively driven the Falmer into extinction, and mankind became the sole remaining master of Skyrim. Okay, so cool story, Nate, but what exactly did it have to do with the Eye of Magnus again? Well, the clear implication is that its presence in Saarthal is what really led the elves to attack it in the first place, and sparked the whole conflict to begin with. The thing is, even this revelation leaves us with a lot of questions. Like, what was the Eye doing in Saarthal? Remember, one book suggests that Nords dug it up and found it for themselves, but why was it buried there? And how can we be sure that's what really happened? Furthermore, why did the elves want it so badly? What were their plans, or what were they afraid of? Remember, we don't even know how powerful the Eye is anyway, so the possibilities are endless. Alrighty, let's just pause the video right here. Well, not actually pause, you know what I mean. So, the Night of Tears and the human/snow elf war we just talked about seem to be merely one of two major historical conflicts the orb was involved in that took place before the events of Skyrim. The problem is, in order to understand the other one, it's important we're all on the same page regarding how Skyrim's College of Winterhold questline plays out. So, real quick, we're gonna summarize that storyline, point out everything that's important, and then we'll move on to talk about the other historical event/war that concern the Eye. I promise, it'll be worth it. Here we go. Shortly after we discover the orb and the college takes it in, the university will start to be visited by a strange group of high elf mages, claiming to be members of something called the Psijic Order. These men will come off as mere gracious visitors at first, and can be spotted having pleasant conversations with professors. Though we soon learn, they've been asking to speak with us specifically. Eventually, when we do talk with one, the dude will freeze time for everyone but you and him, and privately explain what's going on. He's clear that he means no harm, and that the Psijics are the good guys, but warns that by finding the Eye of Magnus, we in the college have set in motion a horrible chain of events that we have to be prepared to deal with. The elf is very vague in details, refusing to elaborate on anything, but specifically warns us to keep an eye on Akano, the Thalmor's representative to the college. With that final word of wisdom, he disappears. Throughout the remainder of the story, these Psijic people will frequently appear to the Dovahkiin in visions, and offer foggy yet helpful and foreshadowing advice. Okay, so right off the bat, a good question worth asking is, what is the Psijic Order? Obviously they're connected to the Eye, so this is something to investigate. Well, Skyrim doesn't really tell us about them, but thankfully, previous Elder Scrolls games, and especially the Elder Scrolls Online, have a bit more lore on these people. The Psijic Order is perhaps the oldest known magical guild in all of Tamriel. While we don't know when exactly it was founded, we do know their first recorded mention in history was way back in the early First Era. They're also apparently based out of an island called Artaeum, that's usually been located in the Somerset Isles, but more on their home in a second. In ESO, we learn that they're actually the original founders, or first practitioners, of mysticism, a school of magic that centers on the very manipulation of the physical world itself. And they are very, very secretive. What we do know is that on occasion members of the Psijic Order have been known to advise various political rulers across Tamriel, such as kings and emperors, and in very, very rare instances, they'll directly intervene to prevent a war or something horrific, like a Daedra invasion as they did in the ESO. But when they're not active, oftentimes the entire guild will just disappear every now and again. Not only will they vanish, but their island Artaeum will also go with them and just be deleted. Oftentimes they'll be absent for hundreds or thousands of years in a row, only to return briefly in order to help solve a major problem or something. Presumably what's really happening is that the Psijics are just moving themselves and their island to another plane of existence beyond the mortal realm. Maybe they're going somewhere in Oblivion or something like that, but we're not actually too sure how it works. Now, funnily enough, according to every single book we can find on the subject, no one has heard from the Psijics nor their island since the year 110 of the Third Era, around 520 years prior to the events of Skyrim. So their intervention during the Eye of Magnus debacle is extremely notable. It's their first appearance in half a millennium. They don't do this very often. Obviously, they must be worried. Okay, well, back to the college's questline. So, following our warnings by the Psijics and everything, the professors will begin an extensive campaign of research on the Eye, reviewing every single book and tablet they can to try to learn anything, really. Soon, they discover evidence of a staff that can possibly exert some degree of control over the Eye and send us on a short series of quests to go locate it. Ultimately, said staff is tracked down to Brunjanar, an ancient Nord city that once served as the original capital of Skyrim after Ysgrimor's conquest. When we go down there, we'll find the staff in the hands of Morokai, a legendary dragon priest who will be very unfriendly. We'll have to defeat the creature in battle and take the staff from his corpse. Let's actually stop right here again and talk a bit more about Morokai and the Labyrinthian. I promise we're almost done with the college's story anyway. The fact that the Staff of Magnus is here, at another ancient Nord ruin, while the Eye itself was all the way at Sarthal, indicate that the Nords of old may have known a bit more about the object than we think. Not only did they discover / somehow acquire the Eye of Magnus, but they also found a staff that could influence it. Sarthal and Brunjanar are admittedly cities that seem to have been populated at different times, however. Remember, the first was a Nord colony that ended up suffering total destruction by the elves in the Merethic era, and was never resettled. Brunjanar, on the other hand, was built after the Nords conquered Skyrim, and acted as an early capital. So why did they bring the staff here, exactly? We'll get back to that. For now, let's finish up running through the college's story. After the staff has been recovered, upon our return to the college, we'll find it in total chaos. Apparently Akano, that Thalmor elf the Psijics warned us about, made his move and barricaded himself in the building the Eye was being stored in, and is now trying to harness its energy for his own evil ambitions. He's already killed numerous professors and students who got in his way. We're not really sure what Akano's grand plan actually is, and we never do learn. He may have been trying to harness the Eye's power to benefit the Thalmor as a whole, or he may have been acting independently, and just wanted to use the Eye to help him take over the world by himself, or something like that. Either way, we need to stop him. What will ensue is a relatively unique boss fight. You see, by the time we get to the elf, Akano's already basically invincible, and getting stronger by the second. So we can't just cut him down normally. Instead, we'll first need to use that staff we just found to weaken the Eye, which will cause Akano to lose his invincibility, and then we can fight him. Once we've finally slain this devious elf, those Psijic guys will immediately reappear and congratulate the player on saving Skyrim, before explaining that they're just gonna take the Eye of Magnus away from us and watch over it themselves, because clearly it's too dangerous. And with that, they vanish with the orb, and the college's questline is effectively completed. Now, I'm just gonna be honest and say, I've always hated this ending and thought it was a terrible conclusion to the story. We're never told how Akano was leveraging the Eye's power. We're not even told how the staff is able to influence the Eye. It's just an objective marker. And we're never told why the Psijics didn't just take the orb away sooner. Seriously, if they can just make it disappear whenever, why allow us to suffer so much needless death and trauma? Come on, Bethesda. Well, thankfully, I can assure you that the story doesn't end here, and the Elder Scrolls Online, which would release 3 years after Skyrim, would make a few interesting revelations about the Eye of Magnus. Most notably, that the device was probably, or most likely, behind an Akaviri invasion of Tamriel. For those of you who don't know, Tamriel is just one of a couple major continents on this planet. We already talked about another called Atmora, but then there's another called Akavir, that's said to be across the far eastern seas, and home to numerous alien-like civilizations and monsters. We know very little about this place. It's never been mapped, and evidently the ocean that separates Akavir and Tamriel is so massive and treacherous, few people have ever made the journey. Nevertheless, despite this great distance, in the year 572 of the Second Era, roughly 1,000 years before the events of Skyrim, an Akaviri army crossed that sea and invaded Tamriel. In fact, they invaded Skyrim specifically. Little is known about these invaders. Most of our sources refer to the attackers as the Kamal, or Snow Demons. And allegedly, they were something other than human or elf, a race no one had ever seen. Even stranger, while the events of the Kamal invasion are pretty well documented, meaning we know where it began, what battles were fought, etc., the exact reason the Kamal were invading is one of the Elder Scrolls universe's biggest mysteries, as the Snow Demons never bothered to send out envoys with peace terms, and the way their army moved just didn't make sense at all. Apparently, the Kamal started by surprising the city of Windhelm with a massive fleet, and quickly captured and burned it to the ground, before proceeding to gain control of most of northern Skyrim, and destroying numerous other Nordic towns in the process. Within a few months, the Snow Demons had conquered like half of the province, and the Nords were just so unprepared for what was essentially an alien invasion to them, they could never mount an effective resistance, and many humans started to fear their entire country would soon fall. But then, when all hope was lost, the Snow Demon army just packed up and moved in its entirety to Morrowind, where they started attacking the Dark Elves instead. What? Why would they do that? Why almost conquer all of Skyrim and then just decide to essentially give back all of the territory you took and start another war at the same time? If that sounds like a really silly strategic decision, that's because it was. As soon as the Akaviri army stopped marching in Morrowind to lay siege to a fortress, they were defeated by a massive joint army of Dark Elves, Argonians, and Nords, who had all teamed up to save their continent. In the end, pretty much every Snow Demon was killed, though a few managed to flee back to some ships and presumably sail home to Akavir. And that's how the whole conflict ended. The people of Tamriel would spend hundreds of years afterwards trying to figure out why exactly they were subjected to such trauma. And every book on the subject points out that the Akaviri motives, still to this day, are unknown. We could spend the next 10 to 15 minutes going over various community theories and ideas behind what really happened, but thankfully, as you might be able to guess, we don't need to do that, because the Elder Scrolls Online seems to have revealed what their true objective actually was. You see, the Kamal were never interested in trying to conquer all of Skyrim or slay all of the Nords or anything. They were looking for something. ESO introduced a new book titled The Second Akaviri Invasion, which was another historical account of the Kamal's invasion of Skyrim, specifically written from the perspective of someone who's trying to prepare the province just in case they're invaded again. In this book, the author states that during the Snow Demons' original invasion of Skyrim, a few of the creatures were actually captured. And, well, I'll just quote it for you. Few Akaviri knew any Tamrielic, and most died under interrogation. One report stated that the Kamal king was seeking someone, or something, called the Ordained Receptacle. But this could easily be a bungled translation. End quote. This explains their behavior. The Snow Demons were never trying to conquer Tamriel